the case might be. Let me welcome you to this first webinar of the African Community of Practice on Natural Capital Accounting. My name is Raffaello Cervini. I am a lead environmental economist with the World Bank and coordinator for the Global Program on Sustainability. So the World Bank is teaming up with a number of partners in Africa, a number of UN agencies, the UN Gaborone Declaration for Sustainable Africa, UNECA, CI, and a number of other partners to basically promote this effort, this initiative, as a way to basically promote the use of natural capital accounting and valuation of ecosystem services across Africa. Maybe let me just say a few words on the practical aspects. I want to keep this short to maximize the time for actual discussion. So we're holding this meeting by WebEx, which is a very good platform, provided that people stick to some ground rules, namely that people keep their microphone muted when they're not talking. And for the sake of preserving bandwidth, I would suggest also that people don't use the cameras unless they're talking. In terms of the meeting itself, we have 3 speakers today. Mr. Harsen Nyambe from the African Union Commission, Ruud Jansen from the Gaborone Declaration for Sustainability in Africa, and Kiruben Naicker from the government of South Africa. So I would ask these 3 speakers to limit their remarks to about 10-12 minutes really maximum, so that we can keep some time for interactive discussion and try to kind of wrap it up in the hours that we have planned for this meeting. So I'll say a few more words later on the practicalities of raising questions, but let me just offer some very quick remarks and context. So this is the first webinar of this newly started community of practice for natural capital accounting in Africa. This is an initiative that we started some months ago with the partners that I mentioned before, and is really intended to kind of provide a platform that would facilitate the exchange of experiences on this work, kind of make easier for people to kind of generate the information that can be used, but also to kind of facilitate really the dialogue with the end users of this information across Africa. The excellent news that I'd like to share with you today is that we have 225 people signed up from 31 African countries to join the community. And so we thought that we would get started today with a meeting that would provide a bit of a sort of launch pad for the work to come. And the idea is to ask the 3 speakers to provide their views and experiences on how to link natural capital accounting and valuation of ecosystem services to policy, to end use. And so we'd like to hear their experience in very summary terms, but also their views on how to move things forward, take into account that, of course, as of the last 3 or 4 months, we are operating in a totally new world, in which nevertheless the role of natural capital accounting becomes even more important as a way to understand how better management of natural resources can offer, let's say, resilience to shocks like this pandemic, and also how to use this information from natural capital accounting to inform the recovery effort that will follow the COVID. So this is the context. I'm gonna now briefly turn the mic to the first speaker, and the idea would be to hear from them in turn, and then we should be able to kind of pick questions. And I think ideally, given that we have a large number of participants, which is great, I would encourage everyone to basically pose short and pointed questions using the chat function in WebEx itself. Hopefully that will be straightforward. And feel free to basically address the question to everyone. We have a couple of colleagues in the team, Kim in particular, that will help us kind of gather the questions, and after basically when we come to the Q&A part of the session, I'm going to try to kind of summarize the question and pose them to the three panelists. We're probably going to have a first round around the questions that are likely to be of common interest to everyone, and then kind of time permitting, we're going to kind of summarize and invite the panelists to a second round of questions that that come from the floor. So without further ado, we are already 10 minutes, so I really want to move quickly into the substance of this meeting. So let me turn to the first speaker. So Harsen Nyambe is the head of environment, climate change, and land management in the African Union Commission. He has 23 years of professional experience, of which 18 in the middle management level, and he also has a distinguished career before that in a number of other organizations, SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community, as well as the other assignments in the African Union and in the government of Namibia. So let me turn over to Mr. Nyambe for the first set of remarks, and with the kind request to kind of limit his remarks to about 10 to 12 minutes.
For giving us opportunity as an African Union Commission to be able to participate in this webinar. In terms of natural resource accounting, that is actually of great interest to the African Union Commission. As you know, the African continent has about 1.2 million people, representing about 17% of the world's population. And even though we contribute less in terms of house emissions, of course less than 4%, our contribution in terms of land degradation or environmental degradation, as well as depletion of natural resources, is actually quite significant. And this is also mainly due to the fact that our population rely to a large extent on resources for their livelihoods. Important also for economic development. And our total GDP, according to World Bank, in terms of statistics for 2015, stands at $2.24 trillion. We are spending, of course, 2% of that actually on adaptation. This GDP does not really reflect the contribution of our natural capital, those related to ecosystem services as well as goods. And value of the resources that we have is not captured. Most of these African countries are considered to be poor, but I think that is mainly the conventional methods that we use to be able to assess the wealth of the countries. Take, for example, a country such as the Democratic Republic of Congo. If we were to of the resources that they have, of course, that country could be miles ahead as far as the classification is concerned. By the fact that these existing methods currently do not actually also account for the depletion of the natural resources. We've got countries in Africa whereby you find that some rivers are completely contaminated by mercury as a result of mining activities. And some of them you find that contamination is massive. And yet all that we do is to report on the contribution of the mining activities or the oil production, to the economy, but we forget that impact on the environment or the pollution that is actually being done on the environment. And we feel that it's actually important to take account of that pollution or that environmental degradation in our accounting system as well, so that we are able to inform actions that we are supposed to in policies. And in the past, the African Union actually had tried or attempted a continental framework that is going to promote natural resource accounting with an effort to be able to promote sustainable use of natural resources and economic development. But of course, those efforts, it seems they did not go far. A workshop to that effect was convened, and about 17 countries participated, as well as regional economic bodies and international organizations. And they even came up with an outline of a framework that was envisaged, as well as terms of reference for a working group that was established. Unfortunately, the implementation roadmap that was developed was actually not in. We are actually working on all of that process. We started consulting a few partners to be able to see how we can move the process forward. And also we take cognizance of the contribution of partners in this arena, as well as member states who have framework. So moving forward, we are actually going to continue to collaborate with the Natural Capital Accounting Community of Practice, so that we can collectively move towards as always has been coordinate continental efforts, and will continue with that role in coordinating all these efforts, so that we can be able to come up with a framework. In line with our mandate, actually, we are supposed to champion continental policies and programs. So basically, if we are able to work with these partners to come up with such a framework, it's possible for us to table it before heads of state, so that it gains political weight and to be actually adopted by member states. Moving forward, I'm actually going to focus on in the field of evaluation, as well as accounting of natural capital, of course, in collaboration with other partners, but also the issues of advocacy. We can promote this initiative, and member states could be able to see the value of adopting such an approach to natural resource accounting, as well as development in general. So basically, in a nutshell, that's what we are going to be doing. And of course, in those efforts, with regional economic communities and the building blocks of Africa.
All right. Many thanks. This is great. You really did an excellent job in kind of sticking to the time, but also at the same time highlighting the very important aspects in terms of the the failure of the current system of recognizing the true value of natural assets and nature. And I think we're also very encouraged by your remarks about the African Union being ready to kind of put its weight behind this initiative in terms of conducting some advocacy with the African governments, and kind of encouraging them to, even in collaboration with the regional communities, to basically take up this approach and these tools for better management of nature and natural capital. So let me now turn to Ruud Jansen, who's the Executive Secretary of the Gaborone Declaration for Sustainability in Africa. So, which is a voluntary agreement that includes 14 African countries to kind of make concrete steps towards sustainability approaches, including natural capital accounting. So Ruud has over 30 years of experience in this area, including number of positions in the government of Botswana, as well as the Netherlands Corporation, IUCN, and UNDP. So, Ruud, over to you. And again, please try to stick to the 10-12 minutes that we suggested. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. I prepared a few slides just to initially tell you, and some friends and colleagues who are on the call will have seen this before. But for those who don't know what the Gaborone Declaration does, just a few slides on that. After which I will speak a little bit about what we do and how it links to some of the work that is in preparation for the CBD. So next slide, Kim. The Gaborone Declaration was signed a month before the Rio +20 conference, and the origins of the declaration are pretty much in line with what we've seen in many forums, which is to say that Africa still has a lot of biodiversity. It's one of the places where the numbers and the concentrations are particularly high, and the diversity is high. But at the same time, there was the acknowledgement that Africa needs those resources to further develop. And that development, would need to benefit the local populations. But at the same time, the leaders at the time, 10 African countries, realized that we don't really know much about the true value. I heard Nyambe also referring to the true value of nature and natural resources. There's no confusion about the fact that everybody knows that Africa is rich in its diversity and resources, but very often we find ourselves grappling with getting an idea about the real sort of economic value of that. So the original countries were 10, and we have 4 additional ones. One is colored in as it's already been signed off officially, which is Madagascar. But Lesotho, Uganda, and Angola joined after the meeting in the summit in 2012. Next slide, Kim. The commitments are really to incorporate the value of natural capital, which is the sort of overall definition of what we mean by nature, ecosystems, biodiversity, into public and private sector policies. The second sort of relates to the fact that we want the people to benefit from it directly in terms of sustainable development and sustainable production. And the third commitment really is to make sure that we start measuring those commitments and achievement of those targets. Next slide. The overall GDSA structure is such that we've established a forum of ministers. We're planning a next meeting in November, Corona permitting, I must say. And just to show you that it's a relatively small GDSA Secretariat set up in Botswana, supported by the government of Botswana and Conservation International, predominantly, with a few resources that we get from third parties from time to time, and we work with our national focal points, some of which are on this call, which I'm very, very happy about. Next slide. So when it comes to our work on natural capital, on the basis of the explanation I've given before, is that first of all, we are very encouraged by a number of UNEA and Jansen resolutions, and also I make reference to the IT target, that there's an increasing appreciation of the fact that we need to do more work on natural capital. And by that we mean the different ways of doing natural capital accounting, which can include work specifically on say, topical issues like forest and water and land. But more importantly, and I think, and increasingly, to put it that way, we're seeing a lot more work in relation to ecosystems and biodiversity for this particular work on natural capital. And I know that Kiruben is going to talk about that a bit more. As I mentioned here in the slide, the methodology is clear. We don't have to worry about that, other than saying that for experimental ecosystem accounting, we're still working on drafts, accounting guidelines, but we hope that by 2021, we'll get more guidance from UNSD on how that works. In terms of the GDSA, and we've done some work together with NASA and CI, very interestingly in Liberia. And here I just want to immediately sort of link to what we hope to discuss a little bit more in this webinar, is to say, well, it's nice to do natural capital accounting, but where does it really start linking to policy? Well, in the Liberia case, what we did was work on a better upgraded sort of system and methodology on ecosystem classification. It's a matter of extent mapping, but that in itself already paves the way to use that information for better land use planning, for better protected area management, and also for identifying areas of high potential for carbon and red, for instance. This particular methodology, as you will appreciate, does not replace any of the red processes that you need to do to actually get to the credits, but it does show you how best you can focus and hone in on areas with highest potential, just as an example of that. We do a lot of work these days on support projects on the GEF, and we're doing some work also with the Green Climate Fund. Interestingly, not so much Liberia, but Lesotho most recently, and Namibia and Angola have shown interest in doing work that could be partially funded through the GEF on specifically national capital accounting, and also specifically more work on ecosystem accounting. We have a very interesting example of doing biodiversity accounts in Uganda. I know some of the colleagues from Uganda are on the call. They might be able to speak a bit more about this, but in relation to biodiversity accounts, we can now actually put monetary values even on species. And this is helpful in moving forward on putting this value on our species, on our biodiversity, and bringing that to bear on the developments that we need. And also, as Nyambe was talking earlier, it dawned upon me that we often take these issues for granted. When we look at companies and we wanted to invest in companies, we want to see the balance sheets. But in terms of countries, somehow, all the nature and the natural resources are taken for granted. As Nyambe was saying, they're not part of the GDP. We don't look at the balance sheet of a country, but we do use the resources ultimately to add to GDP, but we don't take into consideration that by using, we're also withdrawing, and we're drawing down on that value. So we need to be a bit more specific when it comes to actual, maybe working on kind of balance sheets for countries. And one of the reasons why I mentioned that is that we often assume that our natural resources will be there, our nature will be there to capture those values, our recreational areas, our ecosystems that bring in lots of money for tourism, even though tourism maybe at the moment is not a very good example to use because it's sort of down on its knees in certain parts of the world. But we often forget that those same ecosystems, to be able to maintain that value, to maintain that biodiversity, also need investment. And as everybody will appreciate, for us to know exactly what type of investment is required, we'd also want to know what type of value we're talking about and how much of that value can be sustainably utilized by a certain type and a certain level of investment. So in terms of the CBD, just the next slide maybe came just to put a little bit of the context out of the 2018 report on Africa, and this is music to our ears in terms of the GDSA, because it really does link to our commitments. Is to say that, you know, Botswana, Africa rather, including Botswana, I'm biased because I'm based here, has extraordinary rich biodiversity. It's a place on earth where we can still find these large concentrations. But the true value of nature is not either captured or respected, and therefore we do generally underappreciate what that value is and how we should incorporate that into our decision-making processes. And one of the other examples that I would like to use here, or where I think we're moving in the right direction, just linking back to the latest AMSEN discussions, where that value of nature was reflected in a resolution to take to the CBD, and we actually do have an NCA lead negotiator as part of the open-ended working group for Africa, which is Malawi, working specifically on getting more clarity on how NCA, National Capital Accounting, and biodiversity can be addressed, and how we can get that more solidly embedded in the CBD and the post-2020 agenda. I think I should stop here. I have a few more examples of policy making, but let me refrain from that right now, and maybe I can mention those when we come up through the questions. So back to you, Raffaello. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ruud, and great again to have this very informative overview, and thanks for sticking to the time, which is going to help with the rest of the meeting. So, and again, I would invite people to. I see that there is already a few questions in the chat. So, you know, please, if you have additional questions, just send them in, and we'll do our best to kind of consolidate them for the purpose of the discussion. So let me turn to our third speaker today, Kiruben Naicker, who's the head of science policy and IPBES focal point in the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries of South Africa. So it's great to have also that perspective on IPBES. So he has 20 years of experience in conservation and government policies, covering a number of positions in the South African government, and he has an academic background at the University of Kent. So let me hand it over to him so that we can get after you know, the continental perspective, the GDSA perspective as an initiative supporting a number of countries in the region, a more perhaps country-specific perspective. Over to you. And again, 10 to 12 minutes, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to present the South African experience. My presentation is about the linkages of natural capital accounting in the country and linking it to the policy environment. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background on South Africa. I mean, we are very rich in biodiversity with high levels of endemism, and we've been very receptive to pilot projects, particularly on biodiversity, So again, a very conducive receiving environment for conservation projects and conservation pilots per se. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So natural capital accounting in South Africa is a growing field in South Africa and has a long history of developing accounts, mineral accounts, carbon accounts. So NCA is intended to provide information to policy and decision makers that will support sustainable development and provides a common framework for measuring and tracking over time the contribution of ecosystems to social and economic goals. South Africa's policy context supports the integration of information from natural capital accounts, including biodiversity and ecosystem values, into policy and decision making. Next slide, please. So some of the entry points in South Africa, I mean, the Ministry of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in the presidency has a focus on evidence-based policy making. Some of our environmental policies calls for evidence-based decision making and indicators in the national legislation. These are the NEMA, the Nyambe, which is a science-based legislation, and then of course the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And then we have a medium-term strategic framework tool called the National Biodiversity Framework, and as well as the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. Next slide, please. Further entry points include the need for national environmental indicators in our National Development Plan, and then as well as in the national legislation. Next slide, please. The NBSAP, I mean, it is a requirement of contracting parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, guides the conservation, management, and sustainable use of biodiversity to ensure equitable benefits to the people of South Africa now and in the future. And it has a specific activity integrating the value of biodiversity into the national accounting and reporting systems. Is a high priority activity of the revised NBSAP, which goes from 2015 to 2025. Next slide, please. There's a very strong culture of developing spatial information in South Africa. So the need for spatial development information is supported by a lot of spatial development assessments. There's efforts to formalize the biodiversity units layer in the National Spatial Data Infrastructure System. Next slide, please. Okay, yes. So this is just the National Spatial Development Framework, which is the latest, and it makes provision for the spatial development information, and it has priorities as well. And then as I said, South Africa has a very rich history of conducting these assessments, spatial assessments. We have the National Biodiversity Assessment and the latest National Biodiversity Assessment, which is a key document with headline indicators, as well as some key messages, a summary of policymakers. This is the 2018 one. And we supported Ruud mentioned the Africa assessment for the IPBES Africa assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. South Africa was the technical support unit that supported the development of this assessment and contributed particularly regarding data, spatial data to this assessment, which actually fed into the global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Next slide, please. So some of the progress on NCA in South Africa, at the moment, we are involved in a natural capital accounting and valuation of ecosystem services project. The project involves Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. It is coming to an end this year. There are other efforts, the ecological infrastructure for water security, and water is a significant priority in the country. So again, there's linkages with national capital accounting with these projects. Next slide, please. So some of the institutional mechanisms arising from the project, it has resulted in working relationships between our Statistics South Africa departments, our entity SANBI, and the department and the consultants. It provides a strong basis for integrating ecosystem, social, and economic data, and it's building a network of champions for natural capital accounting. So this is just some of the structures that have been put in place for the project to be implemented. Next slide, please. This is the stakeholder engagement that has resulted from the project, which involved a lot of people, 70 people, 30 organizations. Next slide, please. This was a training workshop that was also conducted in 2019. Next slide, please. A national natural capital accounting seminar for policymakers and a forum, the National Forum for Natural Capital Accounting was launched. Next slide, please. So some of the successes to date, NCA is well embedded in the national government, interest in consultation with a wide range of stakeholders, and it forms a basis for mainstreaming. One of our key successes is the series of natural capital accounts that are going to be published. It was actually supposed to be published in March, but COVID happened, and so it has been delayed. But this is a fantastic development that is coming out of the project that has been implemented. Next slide, please. So the next steps, the finalization of the national strategy for advancing NCA in South Africa, which includes priority accounts, institutional mechanisms, as I mentioned. The national NCA strategy is expected to be completed by June. And then there's a further ongoing engagement in the post-2020 process. And this also includes engagement with the IPBES process and the assessments that are ongoing. Next slide, please. So as we know, all parties are involved in the post-2020 process and in the negotiations up to for COP15. So next slide, please. The post-2020 process involves preparations for COP15. South Africa is the African chair of negotiators for the open-ended working group. We are also chair of AMSEN for the year and the chair of the AU. Next slide, please. So this is just an indication of what is happening in the post-2020 process. I won't go through it. But there's many opportunities for integrating NCA into this process. Next slide, please. Again, this is just an indication to integrate biodiversity values, reflecting the policy entry points for natural capital accounting. Next slide, please. The post-2020 global biodiversity framework, I think this is pretty standard. It's about providing, achieving a more coordinated, coherent strategic approaches are needed to ensure that biodiversity and ecosystem services can continue to support all life on Earth. Natural capital accounting is a transformative driver. It provides a full picture of its connection to the economy. Ecosystem accounts used in combination with information on expenditures provide decision makers with a clear picture, and the need to make use of the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration to mainstream NCA. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Rafaela, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, many thanks. Very informative and great to see all the work that South Africa has been conducting, and with also an eye to the global picture in terms of the global biodiversity framework that will be discussed hopefully in the near future. So we have about 16 minutes left, so we may or may not have time to open it up, but I do have a list of a quick set of questions that I'd like to ask to the panelists to kind of get their views, particularly on the way forward. So I'd like to ask, what do you see, particularly in the current context of COVID? What are the main entry points that we should take advantage of to kind of promote this agenda of natural capital accounting in an African context? And maybe the second part of the question is, what do you see as specific, the top two things that should be pursued through this platform of this community of practice that we are, that we have started, and that today is one of the first activities. So, key entry points and priorities for the community of practice. So, I suggest we start with the first speaker from the African Union, and then go around. I would suggest that can we hear back from the speaker 2 or 3 minutes maximum each, so that we have a couple of 5 minutes at the end for questions from the floor. So, Mr. Nyambe. Can you hear us?
The entry point, I think COVID has come up as a game changer. A lot of factors play managing our ecosystem towards the transmission of some of these, should I say, viruses. To the issues of the areas that you can focus on, of course, in our view, we feel that policy response will be the best approach, but that should be actually complemented by some efforts in terms of capacity building. Thank you.
All right, many thanks. I personally had some trouble. There was a lot of kind of breaking of the signal, so I wasn't able to follow the first part, but I heard the loud and clear your call for focusing on concrete policy responses and on capacity building. So I hope that others had a better chance of listening to you. Let me turn over to Ruud Jansen. Same two questions, entry points, particularly in the COVID world, and top priorities for the community of practice. Ruud?
Thanks, Rafaela. I guess the entry points in our given situation of COVID, has given us a very interesting perspective. On the one hand, there's the value. I think the Partly the sort of illegal wildlife trade has showed us for many years that there's value of it. I mean, you don't have to ask the average poacher, if you like, what the value of nature is or certain species are. We know that. The irony of it all is that, and I think we need to acknowledge that if we do not treat nature with respect, it can throw us a couple of curved balls and will lead us to having to spend a lot of money on reversing some of the negative investments that have come about from us living to some extent too close to nature. I think there are various messages in COVID, but I think as an entry point for this particular discussion, I would say that, on the one hand, there is that recognition of value. On the other hand, let's be very clear that we manage this. Let's not forget that we need to invest. Let's make sure that we address poverty issues at a global level. And to a large extent, just to make sure that we avoid situations like the ones that have brought about the COVID. Just as a particular point that I want to make. But I know at a global level there have been a number of initiatives to really indicate that we should really get a better handle on the illegal wildlife trade, and I think that has the two flip sides to the coin when it comes to value of biodiversity and value of nature. In terms of the community of practice, I think it'll be very good to start linking the practice that we have from some of the real practitioners and the sort of technicians amongst us who do this sort of accounting work and policy. We ultimately, I think, want to see more of the evidence that we're gathering, and I think Kiruben had some excellent examples of that, is how that can go into policy. And I remember some of the discussions we've had in the global forums that some of us were part of with policymakers. And one particular message really resonated with me, and that is that policymakers don't want to look at too many tables and get too many figures thrown at them. They want to really have nicely documented sort of infographics, almost, if you like, that bring home the message, and the actual work can subsequently be done at a more technical level by resource economists and other people that are much better of doing this type of detailed work. But the trick to me is, let's get what we know to date. Let's get the right messages through to the policymakers. And I think this group that we have started is in an excellent position to start making those linkages and make national capital accounting more tangible in the whole field of policymaking. Thanks, Rafael.
Great, many thanks. Very practical suggestions, and I think we should take you on this notion of kind of making the examples of success stories in the use of policy use of natural capital accounting more accessible, and kind of make sure that we keep our audience in mind when we present the material. So let me turn to our third panelist. We do have a few questions, so hopefully there will be time for at least one or two questions coming from the floor. So let me turn to Mr. Kiruben Naicker on the two questions raised before. So the entry points and the community practice role.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, very briefly, I think the IPBES African Regional Assessment looks at some of the transformative frameworks for developing Africa. And I think largely the Agenda 2063, the link to the post-2020 process, and the SDGs is areas where we can definitely interface with that whole process. And in terms of in a COVID world and a post-COVID world, again, it's problematic in terms of if from an Africa perspective, because the recovery plans need to be green, and so a lot of these frameworks need to look at how we're going to actually integrate and recover from COVID in a green, sustainable manner. So I think, again, this is an opportunity to actually mainstream the environmental and biodiversity agenda into these processes, into these transformative frameworks that exist. The IPBES is also busy with a nexus assessment, looking at again the interface between biodiversity, the natural world, and health systems, trade systems. So again, it's a fantastic opportunity to interface with this process and engage Africa, because we need information, we need data to actually inform and enrich these assessments going forward. In terms of the community of practice, I think continue to increase the network and align with other networks, make this community of practice a network of networks, align with the business and the CBD business and biodiversity initiatives and networks, the WCMC, the Capitals Coalition, and the combining forces, looking at the Green Capital Coalition, as well as the Business for Nature. I think these are all networks that we can actually interface with. If it means developing cooperation agreements with these networks, then so be it. I think this is an opportunity to actually interface and expand the network for community of practice. I think there's a great need for data sharing agreements and development of some kind of online central information sharing portal. So the opportunity exists for us to mobilize resources towards such an initiative. I think that's from me. Thank you.
All right, great. And really appreciated that the panelists have been excellent at keeping the time, both in their presentation and in their effort to address the questions. So we have about 3 or 4 minutes left for a few questions from the audience. So here I'm going to read a couple of them, and then we'll turn over to the panelists to see who would like to answer. So the first one is it's on the linkages between the NCA work and commitments that various countries have taken under the SDGs or the Paris Agreement. So how can we use NCA to help move forward on those commitments? So that's the first one. And then the second one, I think it's a bit of a challenge posed to us. What are good practice, good evidence, or lessons learned? What are success stories in terms of how NCA has made a difference compared to business as usual? So who would like to go and address either of those questions? Maybe can I turn to Kiruben maybe for the I think he had a number of kind of good examples from South Africa. Do you want to take the second one of the lessons learned and success stories of how can we make a difference compared to business as usual?
Most certainly. Yes, I think the collaboration with Statistics South Africa, with our entities, I think it's made a huge difference in terms of trying to get Statistics South Africa on board. We have the Auditor General, who has a huge buy-in for this whole process. And so they've actually taken on the publication of ecosystem natural capital accounting process. And this is emerging from the project. So again, there's some fantastic lessons here in terms of collaborating with your national statistical departments and your environment, and interfacing with the other economic sectors as well. So the accounts itself, in terms of uptake, has a greater impact coming from statistical officers as opposed to environmental ministries. I think that's the actual thinking around it. So I think just try and engage sectors outside the environment ministries. I think that would be a way to start.
Excellent, very good. Let me turn to Mr. Nyambe from the African Union for some final words of wisdom, and then I think I'm going to ask Kim to, I think she already put some remarks in the chat, but just to reiterate about the follow-up steps, the material to be circulated and so on. But let's quickly hear from Mr. Nyambe.
Going forward, we would encourage all the partners that are involved in this initiative actually work together, because and that will help us also to be able to share resources and to be able to make traction in terms of implementation of this initiative. But of course, we'll appreciate also the continental frameworks, because that will serve as an example for members of regional economic communities, so that they can benchmark on that in terms of their own policies. Thank you.
Great, many thanks. So let's, I think it's time to wrap this up. Let me ask Kim very quickly to confirm what I think she's already put in the chat in terms of the material and the signing up and so on. Kim, do you want to say a few words, and then I'm going to wrap it up and thanking everyone for participating so actively. Kim.
Sure. Thanks so much, Raffaello. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time to join our webinar. It's great to see you all here. Just as a reminder, please, signing up for the Community of Practice is open to anybody. I've shared the link in the chat box just now. So anyone can sign up if you would like to participate in the Community of Practice in a more formal capacity, as, for example, a focal point of your institution or government. Please do get in touch with us via the contact form on the World Bank Waves website. A couple other things to mention is that when you sign up for the Community of Practice, you can participate in all kinds of activities that we are launching, including working groups, and our next webinar, which is on June 4th, on the revision of the ecosystem accounting guidelines. And finally, the webinar recording and associated materials will be circulated to everyone who registered for this and RSVP'd for this webinar, and also posted on the Waves website probably next week. Thanks so much.
All right, many thanks, Kim. So I think we've come to the end, and this has been great as a first webinar. And of course, we are delighted to see the large participation, both at the Community of Practice itself, as well as today's meeting. So this is excellent news, and I'd like to thank both the panelists for being very clear and articulate in their remarks, as well as very kindly agreeing on the time limits. And I'd like to thank all of the participants for joining and for sharing their views through the chat feature. And so to be continued with the next meeting that Kim referred to. So thanks so much again, and have a good rest of the day.